So I'd like to deepen our inquiry now and talk a little bit more about a soma, or a foundational wounding, which is occurring in the poetic architecture, which I've assembled, which is tracing from the early works of Shelley, notably Queen Mab and Revolt. Also Mask of Anarchy, through Baudelaire, Dostoevsky, Rimbaud, Trakel, Mayakovsky, Celine, and so forth into the latter part of the century. I was thinking about this, and there's a question here of the function of somatic catabasis. And what I mean by that is that this is actually a nervous system level event, which I'm discussing explicitly in the Architecture of the Poet as disclosure, and the submergence which we observe in Trakel throughout Trakel's works, without exception. It's a submergence in the experience of the poetic rending, which is Hölderlin's danger of the approach of the ontos. And this is an increasingly modern position. And the reason for this is a combination of already this sensitivity to the sort of distraction of the world, if you will, to use a little bit of Eliot, distraction upon distraction upon distraction, which is the architecture which has to be desiccated to bring about the darkness, the solitude in Eliot's four quartets. And I no longer have the four quartets in front of me, but what I want to talk about is the rupture, which is at the level of experience, which cannot be intellectualized. And this is in the felt literature of Camus, just as it is very clearly in Artaud. It is in the I Can't Go On, I Must Go On of Beckett. It is in Le Specter's dissolution of the ontological ground in the encounter with the cockroach. It is Sartre's felt nausea. It is Celine's somatic and neurological rupture in the experience of World War I, which is articulated through the revolution of his prose. It is in Mayakovsky's desperate attempt to unify the 150 million. Clearly in Trakel as well. Rimbaud, Season in Hell. Dostoevsky's The Underground Man, or The Underground Spirit. Baudelaire, obviously in Les Fleurs du Mal, and again in Shelley. So my architecture is working in a slightly different dimension than Heidegger. And the idea here is the disembodiment, which again returns us to the soma, or the condition of the body, the lived, felt, experienced nervous system level encounter with existence, and the rending of the historical Western civilizational architecture, which is the symbolic order which triggers a world historical or a transpersonal catabasis, which is being experienced in a redoubled way through the neural architecture of the poet. And we discussed this in the T.S. Eliot guide via the four quartets, where Eliot meta-structurally and meta-architecturally gives us the path of the poet's descent into direct relational encounter with being, and simultaneously the articulation of that encounter through the thinking through languaging act of poetry. And so what we're encountering here is with abundant clarity, perhaps in a foundational moment in human history that we retain to this day. There are echoes of this, of course, in the fall of Rome, perhaps in writers like Juvenal. There are different moments in the human evolutionary history where the symbolic order collapses at a civilizational or even a world level, in which this is why I'm suggesting that this is a transpersonal revolutionary moment in human history, not simply a repetition, but that rather the global collapse of the symbolic order is a redoubling of the fundamental existential poetic condition, which is native, which is to say, even if we go back to tribal and local cultural orders, civilizational orders, that the function of the poet is retained and remains the same in the medicine person or the shaman or the prophet, the individual who occupies the mercurial function of moving across the border between the underworld and the overworld, or the world of night and day. This function of descent retrieval or catabatic retrieval is fundamental to the historical position of the poet in all of human history. But furthermore, that in this period of modernity where the historical function of the poet has been severed, such as the shaman or the medicine person, which was the position of the poet in the ancient architecture, the loss of this function is an existential emergency at the local level of the poet. And it always is and was an ontological emergency at the local level of the poet, but that the civilizational or cultural position has been removed and guttered, and that the poet exists as a solitary entity, now without cultural or communal function, as in Rimbaud. But furthermore, that the order, the symbolic order upon which, as Nietzsche says, he's a surgeon of civilization, or a surgeon of humanity, or a surgeon of culture, that he's doing surgical work upon the body of the corpus or the corpse of the collective, which is a state of consciousness and a state of perception, which anticipates Heidegger in The World's Midnight, and his inquiry into what are poets for with Hölderlin, and the importance of disclosure in the face of instrumentalization. That the poet, the ontological ground of civilization is collapsing simultaneous to the existential condition and the transpersonal, international, and greater historical inheritance of the poet as a neural architecture, as a descent, a catabatic being, which is the one who is descending into direct relationship with the ontos, or being itself. This again is to evoke Heraclitus, in that this work has a long multicultural international history, and this is a neural or somatic subset of beings in relation to being who are sensitive to disclosure, which is to say the neural boundary or the literal membrane of the organism, the somatic architecture of the organism, is close to the danger, as Hölderlin puts it. And this descent into the madness of existential modernity and catabatic modernity, again, everyone from Artaud to Trakel to Rimbaud, this is a condition of sensitivity which is magnified exponentially by the historical conditions themselves which surround this catabatic descent, which is to say the collapse of the symbolic order not only of Western civilization, but of the world civilizational order as it comes increasingly into technological modernity, which is a condensation and compression of space and time into increasingly efficient and high-speed architectures of data transformation, information transformation, and movement of information, whether that be goods, services, codes, etc., light. So this high altitude transformation, or this high transformational state, which I've discussed as modernity, as in a fossil fuel state of industrial transformation and industrial technological transformation, including electricity, including the creation of the digital space or the digital realm, which again is a somatic nervous system level alteration of the way that the being engages in time with reality, or all that is, or being itself. These transformations are impacting at the neural level how the human being relates to itself and to the world. In this transformation, the industrial technological turn, which Heidegger is interrogating in 1936 and 1937 with his work on Hölderlin and What Are Poets For, is his realization, which is an absolutely critical realization, that the function of the poet has not only been disabused from modernity, which is to say a critical part of the civilizational or cultural architecture of ancient societies, but furthermore, that the capacity of disclosure in the poet, and this is why Trakel is so important in Heidegger's evolution of poetic inquiry, moving from Hölderlin into Trakel, is that the poet is accessing magnitudes of this descent architecture, which is proximity to being, and magnitudes of danger in that proximity in correlation to not only the destruction and eradication of the poetic order from contemporary, not only Western, but world civilization, but furthermore, the destruction of world civilizational order itself. That this is not merely a local destruction of culture or a civilization level destruction of culture or the symbolic order of meaning and being in time, but this is occurring en masse by way of condensation via industrial technology, compression of space-time, informational technology. So these beings, which we will call the poets, right? This is a somatic and nervous system level architectural sensitivity to disclosure, in which the descent of the poet is ordained structurally in the being of the poet in relation to being, which is to say the grand, the ontos. That the condition of the poet is state transformed or phase changed in modernity. This is a paradigm shift in the function of the poet, that not only is the poet exiled, but the poet is subjected to a compression of descent pressures, which hitherto has been unseen in human history. A global death of the symbolic order. And that all of this work is then leveraged upon the individual, which of course is well understood as the modern condition of alienation, as described by Marx and Freud as well. But that this condition of alienation throws the poet from the cultural post, from the meaning-making system, into a total redoubled confrontation with being itself in not only a death of a symbolic order, but an institution of an industrial technological order, which has created a hitherto unseen neural and somatic severance from being in time, which is to say dissociation from the body and the architecture of the body, which is to say the body, there's a claim that the body no longer exists, but as an instrument or a tool, which is to say the device that labors alongside or within the machine. And this is where Heidegger's time lives within his work, where Heidegger's work ends at the body, ends at the soma, ends at the nervous system. That even the necessary basic scientific information regarding how nervous system functions impact perception and ceilings of perception is not already in place for Heidegger, as it is not for Freud, working with this fractured, dysfunctional informational order, which is a still emerging technological order of inquiry into somatic architecture, is this early modern time. But to understand this 100 years later, with the necessary nervous system level information and scientific study done on the function of the nervous system and how it pertains to consciousness and how it pertains to seeing and being in time, we can understand these poets and their sensitivity to disclosure and what this means for the possibilities that are made apparent and made realized in the existential literature of emerging modernity, which is to say this thrown upon itself encounter with being in the collapse of the world's symbolic order in time, and how this itself is a new threshold for disclosure.